Welcome everybody, it's Mr. Everett, and I'm here again doing a screencast for you. So just a little update in New Bedford. My street is actually underwater because the snow plows have actually clogged up all the drains, but basically everything over here is wet and icy. So I hope all of you are doing well. I know you've lost power, and I know it's been a while since we've been back in school. So, because we're missing some time, I wanted to provide you with some material here that we can use to go over the West. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a couple slides here, focusing from your American pageant text and the first section of your reading on chapter 26, which focuses both on the stories of Native Americans and settlers that moved out into the West. So we're going to start with the Native Americans first. So we're going to begin with a map here from your text that actually explores Native American tribes before European contact. And if you take a look at this map, you'll notice some prominent names. Over here we have the Iroquois, we have the Navajo, Apache, we have Comanche, and Kiowa, Ute, Spokanone. We also have Cherokee over here, Seminole, and a few others. And Native American tribes existed prior to European contact for about 10 to 15,000 years, and roughly there are about 500 different tribes that grew, lived, and thrived in North America, and all of this without the use of the horse, without contact from Europeans or threats by Europeans. And I just wanted to introduce this map to introduce one key concept, and that is that Native people before European contact did not live in peace with one another. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they were subject to any other conditions concerning warfare and violence than any other people or civilization from around the world. And so, on one hand, it was no tribal paradise, and on the other hand, it was not excessively violent, nor were they barbaric or savage. So, in the terms of cultural relevancy, I wanted to introduce this map to you. And the other thing that I wanted to just go over before we get into the notes themselves is one key important fact about Native American cultural and political contact with each other, and that is tribe-to-tribe contact. So many of the native people were semi-nomadic. They followed herds. They actually hunted. Although some grew food, light agriculture did not produce large river valley civilizations like they did in Mesopotamia and other parts of the world. But on the other hand, cultural and political contact did produce an important interrelationship and interdependency between tribes concerning trade. And the reason why I wanted to introduce this is because it's a key concept that we'll return to later, and that is ritual and traditions in Native American societies were often tied very closely together with trade relationships. And that means that the Navajo, for instance, in the American Southwest desert region, would often wear tribal necklaces containing seashells from areas hundreds, even thousands of miles distant. And that's just one example of the interconnected nature of tribal economics. And we'll return to that in a little bit. So in your first section of your book, one of the key points that your text introduces is this concept concerning a clash between Indians and white pioneers. So I'll give you a second. You can read the slide and then we'll move on. Feel free to pause the video. Okay, so after you've paused the video, you should note that intertribal conflict was actually something that wasn't new. And so even though many native tribes clashed with one another, those clashes were often seen in balance. So no one side really had a technological or political advantage over another. Okay, once white soldiers and settlers appeared on the plains, then what happened, and of course this is after the Mexican War, after the American Civil War, is the displacement of eastern tribes actually made the intertribal warfare even more pronounced. And so I'm just going to return back to this map for a second. And I just want to point out that as the Northeast tribes themselves moved further and further west because of the Indian Removal Act passed in 1830 and because of the growing wave of settlement into the Great Lakes region, into the Midwest, especially as trading and commerce picked up on the Mississippi River, as an intricate network of canals was dug, and as railroads, specifically transcontinental railroads, connected America. More and more of the Native Americans on the eastern side of the United States moved into the Great Plains. And when they did, they created kind of a spillover effect of Native American tribes pushing one another into a very crowded area. And as a result, what happened is many of the stronger tribes dominated the weaker ones, and especially those that had a proud warrior culture on one hand, like the dog soldiers of the Cherokee and Cheyenne, as well as the horse warriors of the Comanche, who were almost unparalleled in their use of cavalry warfare. So, what happened here, okay, is that this push undermined the Native American culture, spread disease, and it weakened their food and trading supplies, specifically as far as bison were concerned. Um, this created other problems as well, but the problems weren't necessarily the result of just an overlap of cultures. There were specific policies that were put into place by the United States. So one of these policies is the reservation system, which was an alternative to the Indian Removal Act. If you remember, during Andrew Jackson's presidency, and especially concerning the Trail of Tears, in which the 5 civilized tribes were moved into the Oklahoma region, many Native Americans agreed, whether they were forced militarily or whether they saw advantage to do so, to move further west because the main concern was their own tribal survival. Now, there are a couple different reasons why Native Americans did this, and one easy way of looking at this is to try and take those reasons and simplify them in terms that we can understand. So Native Americans basically faced 3 choices. First, they could fight. Second, they could surrender. And third, they could flee. So as long as Mexico and Canada presented viable options for Native Americans, then option number 3 really does make sense. That is, of course, if Native American culture and tribal unity could survive a move. And sometimes those moves would be dangerous, not just for the semi-nomadic lifestyle that they led, but I mean, if you think about it, we're talking about women and children, we're talking about tribes that are basically built on the structure of the family. And of course, if individuals are going to flee, that's one thing. But if entire family units flee, it creates other problems. And as we know, Southern plantation owners used this as a tool of control to keep slaves on their plantations. And that is Southern plantation owners did everything they could to build up slave families and family units. That way, it made the chance and option of actually escaping and running away even more difficult. So, if Native Americans fought, then they faced all kinds of other challenges. So we know at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which eliminated the Creek Nation, we know that the long-standing alliances that Tecumseh had built during the War of 1812. We know that Pontiac's Rebellion in 1763, and even King Philip's War in 1675. All three of these examples, as well as the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, were examples of Native Americans trying to form some element of unity to stand up against white encroachment on their land. And in each case, they lost. There are different reasons for each, but for our purposes, when we take a look at Native Americans in the Plains, the lessons that they learn from all of this in their own history, in the history of other tribes, when they stand and fight, is not one of success. And that's important because it's established at this point in history a pattern for Native Americans. We'll come back to that in a little bit. And of course, the last option, if you're not going to flee and if you're not going to fight, is to surrender. And so the United States created a way in which Native Americans could surrender, and that is to move on to reservations. So instead of actually pushing them further and further west, if you think about it, during this period, Americans have already moved to the furthest west they can, to California. And they're trying to settle all the areas in between. So it makes sense to control Native Americans, not simply ignore them. And the reservation system was a government policy in order to do that. So this policy had a lot of problems, and we'll take a look at some of them when we get into our next segment. But I do want to point out here for you that the reservation system itself was not just a way of militarily controlling Native Americans. It was even a way for some Americans, including even reformers, to suggest a peaceful solution. And that peaceful solution was to convert and assimilate Native Americans to U.S. culture at this point. Make them farmers, teach them English, Christianize them, and take away, from an American point of view, all of the savage and barbaric aspects of Native American life so that they get absorbed into America. And remember, at this point, in the mid to late 1800s, this had been a successful model for a lot of immigrants, including millions of them, as they adjusted to American life. And so the idea of convincing Native Americans to do the same made sense, at least to American reformers who thought that the reservation system was a gentler option than open warfare. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. I just want to point out before we get on to the next section is that although Native Americans, many of them were forced onto reservations, and if you take a look at this slide, you will see that many of the Native Americans didn't go peacefully. It presented a lot of other problems, specifically ones about implementation and design. So putting them onto reservations was one thing, but managing the reservations was another aspect entirely. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that and some essential questions when we get into part 2, which I will post in just a little bit. See you then.